George Martin always knew the Beatles were special, but there were moments in the studio when he realized they were more than special. They were years ahead of everyone else. While other bands played for the present, the Beatles were unknowingly writing the blueprint for the future of pop, rock, electronic music, and experimental sound. Across countless sessions, Martin would hear an idea, a chord shift, a studio trick, a strange request, and immediately think, no one else is doing this. This is tomorrow's music. Here are the 10 Beatles songs George Martin believed were truly ahead of their time. Number 10, Rain, 1966. George Martin called Rain the moment the Beatles began using the studio as a creative weapon instead of a simple recording space. They slowed the tape, thickened the sound, and built a swirling atmosphere no band had attempted in 1966. Martin was stunned by how the slower tape speed transformed Ringo's drumming, giving it a heavy, hypnotic swing more appropriate for the rock of the 1970s than mid-60s pop. The real breakthrough, though, was the backwards vocal at the end. Something Martin said was beyond anything happening anywhere else. Lennon loved the effect, but Martin realized its broader significance. This was the birth of psychedelia before psychedelia even hit the mainstream. Martin later said that Rain shouldn't be remembered as a B-side. It was the moment the Beatles discovered a new creative dimension. Everything that came afterward, Tomorrow Never Knows, Strawberry Fields Forever, Walrus, began with the boldness of this track. To Martin, Rain was not just innovative, it was prophetic. Number 9, Tomorrow Never Knows, 1966. George Martin never forgot the moment John Lennon walked into Abbey Road and said he wanted his voice to sound like the Dalai Lama yelling from a mountaintop. That strange request became the foundation of Tomorrow Never Knows, a track Martin believed was so far ahead of its time that even musicians decades later struggled to understand how it was made. What shocked Martin wasn't just the single chord structure or the droning tambura, it was the radical use of tape loops. Seagull-like guitar shrieks, reversed orchestral fragments, sped-up voices, and swirling textures created a soundscape no pop band had ever attempted. Martin said it was musique concrète inside a rock song, something reserved for avant-garde composers, not 4 young men from Liverpool. He also admired how fearless Lennon was. The vocal was fed through a rotating Leslie speaker, creating the floating, otherworldly tone that defined the track. Martin later said the effect was decades ahead of electronic music, predicting genres like ambient, techno, and trip-hop long before they existed. For George Martin, Tomorrow Never Knows wasn't experimental for the sake of novelty. It was a new language. He believed it marked the exact moment the Beatles left pop music behind and stepped into the future. Number 8, Eleanor Rigby, 1966. When George Martin first heard Paul play Eleanor Rigby on acoustic guitar, he instantly knew it was different. But he didn't realize just how far it would take them. Martin proposed something radical. No drums, no guitars, no Beatles playing instruments at all. Instead, an 8-piece string ensemble, recorded aggressively with close microphones that captured every scrape and attack. It was a classical arrangement delivered with modern intensity, something pop music had never heard. What fascinated Martin most wasn't the innovation in production, but the emotional weight of the lyrics. Loneliness, forgotten lives, death, these themes were unheard of in mainstream music. Martin later said, "It wasn't just ahead of its time, it was brave." He saw it as a moment when the Beatles rejected youthful charm and embraced storytelling with real human depth. The harmonic structure impressed him too. The stark minor chords, the tight phrasing, and the cinematic pacing made the song feel more like a short film than a pop single. Martin believed it predicted the rise of chamber pop, film score-inspired songwriting, and emotionally driven orchestral music that would emerge decades later. For George Martin, Eleanor Rigby wasn't evolution. It was a leap. A piece of art that proved the Beatles could transcend rock entirely. Number 7, A Day in the Life, 1967. To George Martin, A Day in the Life was the moment the Beatles proved they weren't just ahead of their time. They were operating on an entirely different plane. The song blended John Lennon's dreamy fatalism with Paul McCartney's burst of everyday chaos, a structure Martin said felt like two different worlds stitched together perfectly. But it was the orchestral idea that convinced him this track was unlike anything in popular music. Martin suggested bringing in a 40-piece orchestra, not to play a melody, but to climb from silence to chaos in a massive free-form glissando. Classical musicians looked confused, some even annoyed, but Martin insisted they trust the vision. The results stunned him. A swirling, terrifying crescendo that sounded more like a psychological breakdown than a musical passage. He later said it predicted the rise of experimental film scores, avant-garde composition, and entire genres of atmospheric music. What impressed Martin most was how the song resolved. After all the madness, all the build-up, all the tension, the final piano chord hit like a seismic shock. 5 men at multiple pianos, striking the same note with absolute force, letting it ring into eternity. Martin admitted that last chord gave him chills every time. Number 6. I Am the Walrus, 1967. George Martin often said, "I Am the Walrus" was one of John Lennon's most astonishing creations, not because it made sense, but because it wasn't supposed to. Martin recognized immediately that beneath the nonsense lyrics and surreal imagery was a brilliantly layered piece of musical architecture far ahead of its era. He admired how Lennon blended rock, classical elements, absurdist poetry, and radio static into a single cohesive soundscape. The song's structure ignored every pop convention, shifting keys, strange harmonic turns, and abrupt transitions that Martin described as musical Dadaism. Yet despite the madness, everything was meticulously crafted. Martin later said the orchestral arrangement, with its stabbing cellos, wandering clarinets, and eerie choir, predicted the fusion of classical and rock that wouldn't become mainstream until decades later. What fascinated him most was Lennon's boldness. John wasn't trying to impress or provoke, he was building a world. The live radio broadcast of Shakespeare added a layer of randomness that Martin believed anticipated sampling culture long before hip-hop or electronic music existed. To Martin, I Am the Walrus was far more than weirdness. It was proof that the Beatles could turn chaos into art, and that Lennon's imagination operated at a frequency the rest of the world simply hadn't tuned into yet. Number 5. Strawberry Fields Forever, 1967. George Martin considered Strawberry Fields Forever one of the greatest technical achievements of the Beatles' career, and one of the clearest examples of them being far ahead of their time. The song Lennon brought into the studio was a fragile, haunting ballad, but what it became was something entirely different. A surreal world of shifting tempos, mellotron swells, and orchestral brass that felt like it came from another dimension. Martin loved the ambition, but he was stunned by Lennon's bold request. Combine 2 different takes, one slower, one faster, each in different tempos and different keys, into a single performance. Technically, it was impossible. Musically, it made no sense. But Lennon insisted he wanted both feelings in one song, and Martin rose to the challenge. He slowed one take, sped up the other, and created a seamless transition so convincing most listeners never realized the Frankenstein stitching underneath. He believed this experimentation predicted the future of studio production, the idea that a song wasn't a recording of a performance, but a construction of possibilities. Martin later said, Strawberry Fields Forever changed how musicians approached layering, editing, and atmosphere. To him, it wasn't just ahead of its time. It was a revelation, a dream you could live inside. Number 4, Because, 1969. George Martin adored because it showcased something he believed the Beatles didn't get enough credit for: their pure musical intelligence. The entire track is built on a chord progression inspired by Beethoven, but twisted into something modern, eerie, and hypnotic. Martin often said the song felt like Renaissance music drifting through outer space. And he meant it. No one else in 1969 was making anything remotely like it. What impressed Martin most was the vocal arrangement. John, Paul, and George sang every harmony 3 separate times, creating a 9-part vocal stack that Martin described as mathematically perfect. He loved how the voices didn't just harmonize. They intertwined, floated, and suspended in the air like a slow-moving tide. The precision required was enormous, yet the Beatles delivered it with absolute calm. Martin later said that if you isolated the vocals, it sounded like a choir centuries beyond its era. The minimalism also surprised him. No drums, no big orchestral explosions, just electric harpsichord, Moog synthesizer, and those otherworldly voices. Martin believed this stripped-back, immersive style predicted ambient and atmospheric music long before Brian Eno or the electronic era made it mainstream. For George Martin, Because wasn't just a beautiful song, it was a quiet vision of the future, whispered in perfect harmony. Number 3, She's Leaving Home, 1967. George Martin believed She's Leaving Home was one of the most emotionally sophisticated recordings the Beatles ever made, and far beyond what any rock band was attempting in 1967. Though Paul and Lennon wrote it, Martin saw it as a miniature opera, 2 perspectives, 2 emotional worlds, and a narrative structure lifted from classical storytelling rather than pop traditions. What struck him first was the subject matter. While most bands were singing about romance or rebellion, the Beatles released a song about family collapse, generational disconnect, and the quiet tragedies that unfold behind closed doors. Martin admired how the verses carried Paul's sympathetic narration, while Lennon's falsetto echoed the distant, aching voice of the parents. He later said the counterpoint felt like 2 lives drifting apart in real time. Even more groundbreaking was the arrangement. With no Beatles playing instruments, the track leaned entirely on a classical ensemble. Harp, strings, and delicate ornamentation that Martin said rivaled the precision of chamber music. He admired how the arrangement avoided sentimentality. Instead of lush romanticism, it delivered a crisp, almost cold backdrop that magnified the emotional weight. To Martin, She's Leaving Home proved the Beatles were capable of artistic maturity years before rock critics were ready to admit it. He believed it showed a depth of empathy, structure, and restraint that positioned the band not just ahead of pop music, but ahead of their entire generation. Number 2, Here Comes the Sun, 1969. George Martin always had a deep admiration for George Harrison, but Here Comes the Sun was the moment he believed Harrison truly stepped into the future. On paper, it's a simple, uplifting song. Bright melody, warm acoustic guitar, and optimism after a long winter. But Martin knew better. Beneath its effortless sound lay one of the most quietly innovative pieces the Beatles ever recorded. What impressed Martin first was the structure. The song shifts subtly between 4/4, 3/4, and 11/08 time, a rhythmic complexity unheard of in mainstream pop in 1969. Yet Harrison made it feel completely natural, smooth, joyful, and accessible. Martin said this blend of sophistication and ease was Harrison's genius finally in full bloom. Then there was the Moog synthesizer. Most artists at the time treated the Moog like a novelty effect, but the Beatles, with Martin guiding the session, used it melodically, integrating it into the heart of the arrangement. Martin later said the Moog lines in Here Comes the Sun predicted the warm, atmospheric electronic textures of the 1970s and 80s. It wasn't a gimmick, it was the future arriving early. But what touched Martin most was the emotional clarity. Harrison's writing felt fresh, forward-looking, and spiritually hopeful, a contrast to the tension surrounding the band. Martin believed the song showed where music was heading, away from heavy studio complexity and toward organic, radiant expression. For him, Here Comes the Sun wasn't just ahead of its time. It was Harrison quietly outpacing everyone. Number 1, All You Need Is Love, 1967.
There's nothing you can do that can't be done.
To George Martin, All You Need Is Love was the perfect example of how the Beatles could take something incredibly simple, almost childlike, and turn it into a message powerful enough to change the world. While many listeners focused on the slogan-like chorus, Martin saw something deeper. The song's structure, arrangement, and cultural impact were decades ahead of their time. What amazed Martin most was the global broadcast concept. Written for the first ever worldwide satellite TV event, Our World, the song wasn't just meant for Britain or the US, it was designed for the entire planet to hear at the exact same moment. Martin believed this was the first glimpse of what music would become in the future. Borderless, instantaneous, and capable of uniting millions. Musically, the track defied expectations. The verses are written in a shifting, asymmetric meter, while the orchestral arrangement, a Martin signature, wove together musical references from Bach, La Marseillaise, and Glenn Miller. He said the combination created a collage of human history, blending past and present into something universal. The message may have been simple, but the craftsmanship was anything but. What Martin admired above all was the timing. At a moment of political tension and cultural upheaval, the Beatles delivered a message the world desperately needed, and Martin believed it captured the future of music's role in society. Not just entertainment, but connection. To him, All You Need Is Love wasn't just ahead of its time. It was timeless, a global anthem before the world even knew it needed one.